I knew instantly when I opened the door that I'd found her.
You know she was dead?
No, I didn't. I had this rush of...
You know she was dead?
No, I didn't. I had...
You know she was dead?
No, I did. I knew instantly when I opened the door that I'd found her.
You know she was dead?
No, I didn't. I knew instantly when I opened the door that I'd found her.
You know she was dead?
No.
Do you notice when John retells the story, and we all know the reality of it today, and take note, when they gave this interview, they also knew the reality. They also knew that when John found JonBenet in that basement, looking back, she was deceased. But isn't it interesting how even in his retelling of it 3 years later, when he retells the story, she's still alive when he finds her, or at least he doesn't know in his retelling whether she's alive or not. More pertinently, John's more interested in communicating that he finds JonBenet in that moment. That's the relief, that's the part he wants to emphasize. Like, it's the first time he becomes aware of where she is. And the part that is strange, the part that I think one needs to ponder is, why does he seem less interested in how she is? Think about that for a moment. If you found someone on the floor, would that be it for you? I found them. Or would your number one priority be, are they alive? Are they okay? Can I establish some kind of communication with them? Can I find proof of life? Can I help them in some way? Because John doesn't even call out JonBenet's name. That also doesn't even happen when Patsy and John read the ransom note. They don't go through the house calling JonBenet's name. And so even in this situation, John doesn't talk to her, doesn't even try to talk to her or resuscitate her. And yet when Larry asks, did you know that she was dead? John says no. And his body language is certainly quite interesting, how his eyes shut down at that question. Do you believe him? Even if you do, it's interesting that Linda Arndt seemed to know instantly that JonBenet was dead and had been for a while. Her upraised arms raised and rigid because rigor mortis had set in. That said it all.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, we are back to dealing with these slips, these little giveaways in the interview. These micro expressions, are they leading us one way or another? And so in terms of what we've just covered, you've got to ask, why are you retelling the story 4 years later, emphasizing I found her rather than how she was found? Because in the year 2000, it's March 2000, you know that she was deceased. So why are you still telling it within the framework that you didn't know what was going on at the time? And I suppose there are two alternatives. The one is that John genuinely didn't know. The other one is that perhaps it was John's priority to communicate, I found her then. And this is quite an important point to be clear on. Isn't John's priority here to communicate not I found her, but this is when I found her. This is the first that I knew something had happened to JonBenet. And also, I didn't know that she was there. In other words, all of this is to assert his innocence rather than to assert how JonBenet was, because this is a critical and crucial difference. Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So hopefully over the last few days and weeks, as I've shared more context, more evidence, more information, you will feel more empowered to conduct your own statement analysis or conduct statement analysis with me, kind of in sync with where I'm going with it, from a much more educated vantage point. I think you'll agree with me that when you're a lot more educated in the minutiae, you are able to conduct far more concise, precise, and effective statement analysis. Do you agree? And I hope you'll appreciate how much a thorough grounding of a case offers you when doing statement analysis. I believe that some people have it the wrong way around, where you can just come into a case and just by doing a kind of glossing over, just doing statement analysis, you can figure out the whole case. Wouldn't that be fun? Wouldn't that be nice? Anyway, without further ado, let's get started on the final half hour of John and Patsy's interview with Larry King to promote their book, and this was in March 2000. And we start with number 1. I feared the worst, but I still held out hope.
And I feared the worst, but I still held out hope that she would be okay.
Now, both John and Patsy are quite emphatic speakers. When they speak, you'll see them sometimes nodding their heads, sometimes shaking their heads. And it's really interesting, this statement that John makes here. Does it have potentially a secondary or ancillary meaning? Let's listen to it again.
And I feared the worst, but I still held out hope.
Now think about that comment, I feared the worst but still held out hope. Think about that comment in terms of a microcosm, in terms of the microcosm of the crime. Let's say the crime as it stood on the early morning of the day after Christmas. I feared the worst, but I still held out hope. Bear in mind there's a ransom note. And then also think about it in a much more expanded sense in terms of the months that went by, and then the next year, and John returns to work, and then there's the grand jury trial and so on, and then eventually writes a book. Think about those words. I feared the worst, but I still held out hope. So again, why have I highlighted this? Well, because I think this is actually how John felt. I think John did, whatever the truth of the situation, did fear the worst, but also did hold on to hope. And I guess what I'm suggesting here that there could be 2 interpretations to that statement, perhaps even more, but at least 2 of them is, the one is that he feared the worst regarding JONBENET, but he still held out hope for JONBENET, and he adds her name at the end of that. But what about another interpretation? What about the situation he was in and the prospects of him getting out of the predicament? What about I feared the worst for myself, but I still held out hope? I feared the worst for my business. I feared the worst for the predicament we were in, Patsy and me, and perhaps somebody else, but I still held out hope. Number 2, where were you, Patsy? And then Patsy says, I was upstairs with, and she doesn't answer, she doesn't complete the thought.
Who were you, Patsy?
I was upstairs with
You
friends.
told Patsy?
I don't remember the sequence.
I've already covered how unlikely it is that you wouldn't really remember telling your wife, the mother of your child, about your deceased child. And that's also a really interesting thing. If the Ramseys knew about what was happening, they wouldn't need to tell each other. Whereas if they didn't know, of course, they would need to tell each other. Patsy seems to be the most agitated and excitable person in the whole house. I mean, do you remember her breathless, hurry, hurry, hurry on the 911 call? And she's suddenly not only paralyzed and immobile at this time, when John finds JONBENET, the whole time they've been sitting there waiting for news, waiting for some information about JONBENET. Now there is information. Patsy seems to be the only one who remains seated and, as I say, immobile. And she's seemingly also the last person in the entire house to know the fate of JONBENET, her own mother. Again, you've got to just ask, how likely is that? What follows after Patsy sees JONBENET is either a truly overwrought mother, and I do believe Patsy was overwrought. I do believe Patsy was distressed. I do believe Patsy was grieving, John as well. But besides that, is there also a kind of religious pageantry going on? I mean, they invited a pastor into their home, Reverend Hoverstock. Or is there also a kind of religious pageantry, a pantomime, not of actual grief, but acted grief, that only a pageant queen well-versed in the performance art could come up with? Or is it a little bit of both? Or am I being unkind? Now, number 3, did you see her? Yes, I did. I then did see her. It's interesting how Patsy sort of falls over her words at this question. It's quite a loaded question. Did you see her? Think about how loaded the question is by asking it that way. Not, did you see her then? Basically, did you see her? At some point in the night, Patsy had to have seen JONBENET. And Patsy would know the full truthfulness of the answer in her mind, in her heart.
Did you see her too?
I heard him scream.
You never saw her?
Yes, I did then see her. My friends.
Do you notice how Patsy, in this particular part of the narrative, when do you see that JONBENET is no longer alive? Patsy number 1, she stumbles, but number 2, she also throws in the word then. Yes, I saw that she wasn't alive then. Of course it was then. There are half a dozen witnesses seeing Patsy, seeing JONBENET. So why does she need to say then?
Did you see her too?
I heard him scream.
You never saw her?
Yes, I did then see her. My friends were.
I'm going to play it one more time, and I want you to pay attention to the question and then the way Patsy answers it, because she answers it by not really answering it. She's asked, did you see her then, or did you see JONBENET? Does Patsy answer, yes, I saw JONBENET? Listen to how she answers it, or really avoids answering it.
Did you see her too?
I heard him scream.
Do you notice that Patsy's asked, did you see her? And Patsy answers, I heard him. I heard him scream. And one also wonders whether there's a broader meaning to that question and that answer as well. In any event, this prompts Larry to ask the question essentially again, and when he does, Patsy stumbles on the answer.
You never saw her?
Yes, I did then see her.
Now, obviously, within the schema of the story, Patsy's saying, I heard him scream, meaning I heard John scream. But we also know within the broader schema of the Ramsey case, someone heard a scream. And someone thought they heard the scream of a girl and that scream was cut off. It was a scream that suddenly stopped. It didn't die down, it suddenly was cut off. Now, whatever happened in Patsy's lived experience, whatever actual experience of the crime was, whatever her reality, I suspect she did hear a scream, and then she did see her daughter. And then?
Did she suffer?
Number 4, I don't know what it is. What is it? What is it? This is quite interesting because here Patsy role plays herself. And here I think you really want to have a look, number 1, at John's reaction, but also how Patsy gestures. She presents herself holding on to, clinging really to John. Within the scenario that we're talking about of being presented with JONBENET no longer alive. This area is a little bit unclear, but from some of the officers who were present, they felt that the couple didn't seem to comfort one another and didn't seem to be near one another almost all the time. It's also noteworthy, if you think about it, that neither of the Ramseys called 911. Did either of them ask anyone to call 911? Who asked for someone to call 911?
Holding me. Wait, I don't know what it is. One of our friends ran into the room and said, we need an ambulance. Tried to dial 911.
Number 5, the others had left. I don't recall.
Was there that I recall.
They all had left. The others had left.
Well, I don't know. There were a lot of people there.
It was a blur to
throughout the
you.
morning.
Yeah,
It was a blur. We had
blur.
victims advocates there. We had uniformed police. We had detectives. People were in the kitchen making sandwiches. I mean, it was
People
chaos.
fingerprinting.
Now, what I always find interesting with the Ramseys is the amount of information they sometimes volunteer. Like you've just heard John describing all the different people there and even what they're doing. That someone's making sandwiches. Patsy will add here that they were leaving behind clouds of fingerprint dust.
There's fingerprint dust
The
everywhere.
evidence crew was there.
Little zoo-like.
And if you pay attention, you'll notice that they can, when they want to, they can give tremendously detailed information. They can volunteer a lot of information in certain areas. And then in other areas, suddenly it's like trying to draw water from a stone. It's very brief answers and very little information is provided. Now, in this particular question, does John really know, when he found JONBENET downstairs, does he really know how many officers were in the house? Does he really not know because he's just been asked? Why didn't you have the officer come down? Did you know how many were there? And he's asked, the others had left.
Was there that I recall.
They all had left. The others had left.
Well, I don't know.
And have a look at John's body language, his hands, the way that they are. But just think about the question. Does John really not know how many officers were in the house when he found JONBENET? I can tell you, there was just the one, just Linda Arndt. It's interesting that John doesn't seem to know because John, in Arndt's words, seemed to be isolating himself. He seemed to disappear in the middle of the kidnapping phase when he was the designated answer the phone when the kidnapper calls person. If you're in the house for 7 hours, are you telling me you're not going to know how many people are in your house at that time in terms of police officers? 3 times when the phone did ring during this period, John was absent. Now consider also how the narrative has changed from a financial or revenge motive to a sexual one. Now, let me just reiterate that. The narrative begins that the person that committed the crime, it's an inside job. Who do you think did it? Well, I think it's someone that knew us, someone that perhaps had a key, someone that has been in the house before. So who specifically? Well, I think it could be the housekeeper. I think it could be an ex-employee, right? All of that is, I think it's an inside job, someone who knows us. And so the motive in terms of that is it's a financial motive. Well, the housekeeper doesn't need a lot of money, or it's a revenge motive from a disgruntled employee, but again, someone that knows John. Well, now that motive has changed by March 2000. Now it's a sexual motive.
Pedophile.
We think it was a pedophile.
So if you say pedophile, is it still a pedophile and it's an inside job? Is it a pedophile that was close to JONBENET? Is it someone that knew the Ramseys, some situation like that? Or are we dealing with, I thought it was an insider. Are we dealing with a pedophile that doesn't know John, doesn't know Patsy, hasn't been in the house before, and is actually a stranger? Because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about Gary Oliva and those sorts of suspects in inverted commas. Do you see how the narrative has evolved? Almost like, well, we'll go with what's stickiest. We'll go with what the public accept and what the public find likely or believable or acceptable or appropriate.
I don't believe there's conclusive evidence of that.
We don't know.
Have you talked to the medical? Did they send you the autopsy reports?
No.
The police have not talked to us at all.
You should really give this part a listen from about 13 minutes to 14 minutes and look at what Larry is asking them and look at how they answer it, because he's going into some of the very difficult territory of the autopsy report. And what they both seem to say is that they haven't actually read the autopsy report. They've written a book about the case, they've hired lawyers, they're promoting the case, and they want to catch the perpetrator, but you're not going to find out what actually happened. And you might say, you know what, you are wrong about some things, and you perhaps wrong about most things. And I would challenge you, when we do these slips, to go through them one by one and say, okay, number 1, I disagree with you. Number 2, and then tabulate all 5 and see how many make sense, how many seem reasonable, and how many don't, and then see whether it is overall, whether it is reasonable statement analysis as far as you're concerned, but based on what we know, and hopefully based on what you know. Is it reasonable to have like the most high-profile case, and even if you haven't read the autopsy report, hasn't it been brought up in documentaries, and didn't you watch them? And didn't friends talk to you about it? And didn't journalists bring it up? And didn't your lawyers ask you about it? And didn't you think about it? I'm not going to play the exact question Larry asked at about 13 minutes and 30 seconds. You can play it back yourselves, but it's basically a question that's really very central to this. And I think that's in a way the thing that the ransom note was trying to cover over, is what was really going on with JonBenet at the time, not her stealing a piece of pineapple, but something else was going on, wasn't there? And the autopsy basically goes into that area and finds there's this strange bifringent material in JonBenet's body, and is that the kind of thing that a pedophile would typically do?
I don't believe there's conclusive
we don't
evidence
know.
of that.
We don't know.
Have you talked to the medical? Did they send you the autopsy reports?
No.
If you listen to the whole statement, John described the perpetrator as male and a monster. Isn't this playing the same gambit both ways? You know, they don't know now that it's a pedophile when it comes to what did the pedophile actually do. They imply they know it's a sexual crime because they think the perpetrator is a pedophile. But when asked directly to verify, this is so important, when asked directly to verify the sexual nature of the crime, they don't know. They can't say. And Patsy would say in another interview, she hasn't even read the autopsy report. I'm not going to take it further than that. I think it was Greg McCreary who said, never or rarely in the history of profiling has a sexual crime ever been mixed with a financial motive. That's where you have a single perpetrator. And then, of course, there was the Charlotte Cena case that occurred where precisely this mixing of motives did happen. Ironically, I think the psychological fabric of the Ramsey case does involve money, though not in the terms expressed in the ransom note, and in sex, though not in any terms we're allowed to talk about. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.